From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Our top story tonight is on wildfires. Fueled by hot and dry weather, wildfires around the world continue to grow. Here are images of the Dixie Fire, California's biggest wildfire. It has wiped out the historic mining town of Greenville. The blaze has swelled to almost 255,000 acres in size, local authorities say. This is Siberia, yesterday the coldest part of Russia, which borders the Arctic Ocean. And these are Greeks fighting wildfires in their nation. Here we see Azerbaijanians helping Turkish firefighters with their wildfires. All of these are a direct result of global warming. Here's Bob Ward of the Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change at the London School of Economics.
The Earth is warming, and that means periods of hot weather are becoming more intense and more frequent, and that leads to faster evaporation of water, which dries out vegetation, increasing the risks of wildfire. And we're seeing wildfire seasons becoming longer and more intense all around the world.
Daily U.S. COVID cases have now crossed 100,000 for the first time since February this year. It has led to state governments and even news agencies to take action, even as protests against mask mandates continue. California has ordered healthcare workers to be vaccinated against COVID-19 by September 30th. CNN has fired unvaccinated employees for coming to the office. And golf course businesses are struggling to stay open as COVID-19 outbreaks surge among staff. Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina is one of the 3 Republican lawmakers who filed a lawsuit last week against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. This was over the mask mandate in the House of Representatives. He is now tested positive for COVID-19. On the other side of the world, in Wuhan, China, residents queued up outside a gym to get tested for COVID on Thursday. Authorities of the city of 11 million vow to finish testing all its residents by the end of the work week. Testing has put in place after the recent discovery of domestic cases of the virus Delta strain in China. This is all happening as the search for COVID's origins continue worldwide. China is doubling down on its claims that the virus may have been leaked from a U.S. Army lab. It is asking the World Health Organization to investigate the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland. President Joe Biden, on the other hand, has ordered an intelligence review of the virus's origin. And a right-wing Indian leader is claiming that COVID originated in Pakistan. Democracy Now! Is reporting that Pfizer is charging the European Union $23 and Moderna $25. A recent study by the People's Vaccine Alliance found that both pharmaceutical companies are charging governments as much as $41 billion. This is above the estimated cost of production. America's chief medical officer, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said that the third COVID vaccine shot for those with weakened immune systems is a very high priority. Moderna says the booster shot is likely to be necessary this fall due to the virus's Delta variant. This is despite the World Health Organization's appeal to rich countries not to use a booster shot until the rest of the world gets the first dose of the COVID vaccine. A Utah Muslim is suing his ex-employer who denied him prayer breaks and called him a terrorist. Alan Goodson was a Christian when he joined Bradshaw Chevrolet 2 years ago. However, after he converted to Islam, his supervisors denied his request to take prayer breaks at work. Goodson is suing over alleged violations of the Civil Rights Act Title VII. This prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. The federal lawsuit is being filed on Goodson's behalf by a Salt Lake City law firm, as well as the Council on American Islamic Relations. Shontel Brown defeated Nina Turner this week in a closely watched special Democratic primary in Ohio's 11th congressional district. Turner was Bernie Sanders' former campaign co-chair. She's also a critic of America's no strings attached policy of $3 billion in aid to Israel. Brown is the chair of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party and supports unquestioned U.S. financial aid to Israel. She has said that a 2018 trip to Israel gave her insight into the importance of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. That trip was sponsored by the American Israel Education Foundation, which is affiliated with AIPAC. AIPAC, or the American Israeli Political Action Committee, is the largest pro-Israeli lobby group in the U.S. But it was another lobby group, the Democratic Majority for Israel, that spent hundreds and thousands of dollars on the race to elect Brown. Its CEO, Mark Mellman, called Turner an implacable foe of Israel. The Intercept reports that an oil and gas heir helped fund the attack on Turner through the Democratic Majority for Israel. Samson Energy's chair donated $1.25 million to the Democratic Majority for Israel. In a statement Tuesday night, Turner said, "We didn't lose this race. The evil money manipulated and maligned this election." Democratic Congress member Rashida Tlaib is calling on Democrats to return a recent contribution from real estate tycoon George Marcus. Marcus donated $1 million to the House Majority Political Action Committee just weeks before Democratic lawmakers failed to extend the eviction moratorium. Marcus is the chairman of both the real estate brokerage firm Marcus and Millichap and the real estate investment trust Essex Property Trust. Meanwhile, landlords in Georgia and Alabama have asked a federal judge to block President Joe Biden's new 2-month moratorium on evictions. The Alabama and Georgia chapters of the National Association of Realtors filed their motion with U.S. District Judge Dabney Friedrich. Friedrich is an appointee of former President Donald Trump, who ruled in favor of landlords in May. Rent moratorium was extended in a limited form after Congresswoman Cori Bush held a 5-day-long protest on the steps of Capitol Hill. This saved about 90% of U.S. renters. About 15 million people, mostly Black and brown Americans, would have faced eviction without the extension. 75 House Democrats are asking President Joe Biden to immediately shrink the population being held at Guantanamo Bay and finally shutter the prison. In a letter to Biden released Thursday, they asked him to take the steps necessary to finally close the prison. It also asked that the U.S. government ensure that the remaining detainees are treated humanely. The letter was put together by the House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff and the Representatives David Price and Ilhan Omar. Among the co-signers are several committee chairpersons. These include Foreign Affairs Chairman Gregory Meeks, Armed Services Chairman Adam Smith, and Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler. Palestinians of Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood have refused an Israeli Supreme Court offer to pay rent to Jewish settlers who occupy their homes. The court has offered Palestinians this as a compromise. It was part of the ongoing Palestinian struggle to stop Jewish settlers from forcibly expelling them from their own homes. The High Court proposed that the Palestinian families could stay in their homes for now if they begin to pay rent to Jewish settlers. The deal was rejected by the families, who insisted that they are legal owners. The planned expulsions in East Jerusalem sparked the last Israeli attacks on the occupied Gaza in May. The United Nations has described the planned removals as a possible war crime. In related news, Hezbollah launched rocket fire in response to Israeli air raids in Lebanon. This was amid an escalation of cross-border hostilities. Kashmiris protest Indian occupation by going silent. 2 years after the Indian reinvasion of Kashmir, the situation is getting worse. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
August is big in South Asia. August 14th is Pakistan's Independence Day. August 15th is India's Independence Day. But August is no cause for celebration for Kashmiris. August always opens the wounds of Kashmir. They long for freedom, or Azadi as they cry. In 2019, August became even worse for Kashmiris. On August 5, 2019, India re-invaded Kashmir. Yes, re-invaded. India already had almost 1 million soldiers in Kashmir. Almost 1 heavily armed soldiers per 10 Kashmiris. On August 5th, they brought more. Dismissed their nominal autonomous status, banned internet, stopped the United Nations, arrested even pro-India Kashmiri leaders, forced Amnesty International out. August 5th has become a really bad day for Kashmir, so Kashmiris decided to go silent. Shops were shut down, hardly any traffic on the road, and people stayed home, silent. They wanted their silence to be a loud statement for Azadi. In Pakistan, however, Kashmiris were louder. Tens of thousands of Pakistanis went out for Kashmir. They observed a day of solidarity for Kashmir on August 5th. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan also spoke up for Kashmiris.
What they had done to Kashmir, unless and until they lift the curfew and then restore that Article 370, there's no chance of talking. So that's why we've asked President Trump and other world leaders to intervene.
Kashmiris were promised by the Indian Prime Minister Nehru that they can decide about their future. Then the United Nations in 1948 passed a resolution allowing Kashmiris their right to join Pakistan or India. Kashmiris are still waiting, waiting to vote, waiting for Azadi.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
To get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. In one of our previous analysis segments, we discussed the education of Rohingya refugees. We shared the findings of the report, Let Rohingya Learn, by the Burma Task Force. Head of the task force joins Saliha Farouk for a detailed conversation. Let's watch this again.
Thank you very much. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Adam Carroll, who is Director of United Nations Program at the Special Burma Task Force campaign. Thank you so much, Adam, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Now, you recently authored a report entitled Let the Rohingya Learn. This publication was put out on the heels of a statement by Cox's Bazar CSO NGO, which reported that a lack of formal education for children and youth was being faced by the Rohingya communities today, and for a long time, of course. Tell us about these gaps in education for these refugee children and youth.
Yeah, thank you for your attention. This is really a very serious crisis, the lack of access to education. Rohingya community members have been bringing this up as a priority and asking us to get more involved. So we have done some research, issued this report, And indeed, not only have Rohingya been systematically denied access to education in their homeland, in Rakhine State, Burma, but now as refugees in Bangladesh, about 600,000 children have really very limited educational opportunities. The government there has limited them because their idea is that the migrants need to go home, even though that's not likely anytime soon. And so they were worried about providing more services. Services have been largely limited to food and shelter. And the education that has been allowed in the Cox's Bazar camps have been the early grades, and they have not even been allowed to call them schools. They're called learning centers. And the international NGOs have very limited kind of socialization, basic skills for the youngest children. And there is no certification, there is no high school or pathway to higher education. Those doors are locked. And this is why we think a special pressure on the Bangladesh government is needed to change those policies.
Thank you. Now, experts are saying that these barriers to schooling for Rohingya refugees is not necessarily due to limited resources, but from Bangladeshi policies, as you mentioned, that deliberately deprive Rohingya children from education for the purpose of preventing their reintegration into society. This is a very interesting fact that was released recently. If you could tell us about the long-term implications of such a practice from the Bangladeshi government.
Yes, really, it's an extension of genocidal policy. When we see in Burma that the government there refused access to Rohingya children for 2 generations, what does that do to a people? And then once these traumatized people have fled into Bangladesh, which has taken them on, then to deny their children a future by restricting education, it's really a shocking thing. We should say, however, that a number of host countries do something similar. They deny refugees, and specifically the Rohingya, refugee status legally. They just say, oh, these people aren't refugees, they're migrants. And doing so, they then restrict education. Certainly, many countries, and we deal with this in the report a bit, Malaysia, for example, which has many Rohingya refugees there, it does limit access in public schools. India limits access in public schools. The policy is to keep Rohingya isolated from the general population. And we certainly see that in Bangladesh again, this policy of isolation and restriction. They are afraid the Rohingya will stay, and they're not seeing the Rohingya as a potential resource. Just as in the United States, there are some groups that don't see immigrants as resources, and they don't want to invest in them. They see them only as threats. This is a wrong way to think. However, we, Burma Task Force, with our allies, support eventual repatriation. And I understand that the Rohingya would prefer to go back to the homeland, but it is not safe, and they don't have rights. And with the current coup and the current unrest and the conflict in Rakhine State, we're not going to see repatriation anytime soon. So let's invest in education.
Focusing in on one of the major findings from the report that you recently published, if you could tell us about how the rights restrictions and exclusions that resulted from Burma's 1982 citizenship laws might have led to Rohingya children being illiterate to begin with, and how that legacy has continued on well after their fleeing of Burma.
Right. Well, Burmese government statistics show that Rakhine State has an overall fairly high literacy rate, 84.7%, I think, and yet the literacy rate among Rohingya children there before the mass displacement was really low. I mean, 80% were not literate. And so the lack of access to schools was partly because after 2012, the policy shifted to prevent freedom of movement to Rohingya in the Rakhine State area. And without freedom of movement, they couldn't go from village to village to their little schools. And Rohingya were also sometimes just banned from the schools, but other times Rakhine Buddhist teachers just didn't want to teach them. There was a whole range of exclusions that impacted access, and that went all the way up to Sitwe University, which originally had Rohingya students, but then they banned Rohingya students. So it's systematic, and in the name of national security, of course, it was done that way, and prolonged. So this kind of terrible targeting of children just went along with the general genocidal policies to disenfranchise Rohingya people. And of course, that led to the mass atrocities. So the Rohingya who remain in Rakhine State, relatively little is known of their conditions because they are kind of locked up in an open air prison. Very few international observers have been allowed in, and they don't say a lot because they're afraid of losing that very slight access. So we have to assume that they don't have access to education now, except, and I should put one exception here that is important, the Rohingya themselves have been very resilient. And the report finds that volunteer teachers have been trying to teach their own community during this whole period of oppression in Rakhine State, in Burma. Quietly, secretly even. Some of them are madrasas, some of them are regular schools, but they've been trying to teach the Rohingya children. And now, as those teachers were displaced into Bangladesh, for example, they are continuing this very quiet education, but it is limited. It is very limited. And unfortunately, with the Bangladesh government not permitting international NGOs to support these grassroots efforts, there is a disconnect. To really support these community-run educational efforts in the refugee camps of Bangladesh, there needs to be certification. There needs to be an overall system. And there are some kind of foundation for that in the madrasa system, but it needs a lot more support, and it needs acceptance by the governments no of banning internet access or banning phone service. Much of the pandemic last year, there was no internet service in the Bangladesh camps, and so that meant that there could be no distance learning. It really one layer upon another of exclusion.
Thank you for that insight. Now, your report spotlighted a few major global actors that had stood in the way of this education, as you mentioned, this idea of support. When it comes to Rohingya education and supporting it, why do nations place such significant obstacles in the pathway to Rohingya education, especially in regards to a few major countries that prohibit Rohingya from accessing public schooling as well as this community-based education that you mentioned?
Right. Well, this is just a divisive ideology, a particular kind of politics. You know, we saw during the pandemic how uh, in Malaysia, xenophobic discourse suddenly targeted the Rohingya. Rohingya refugees in Malaysia had, until the pandemic, had relatively good lives and access, relatively speaking. It wasn't perfect by any means, but then suddenly another layer of online social media campaigns vilifying Rohingya as threats, even as agents of infection, bringing the virus to the general population, and so forth and so on. So that made it even harder for the government to look at Rohingya as part of the whole, and instead they looked at them as strangers who don't even deserve hospitality, but deserve somehow control. So this is a kind of way of thinking. It's fear-based. It's very unfortunate. And in Malaysia, we see a largely Muslim nation treating a Muslim refugee population so badly. We also see in Saudi Arabia some similar restrictions. It's a global problem, and it needs to change. I did want to acknowledge that Anika Rahman, who's worked with us, engaged with did some interviews directly with CSOs in Bangladesh. And also Imam Malik had done some research on the madrasa system, especially in Rakhine State, but somewhat in Bangladesh. So these helped inform our report, as well as a wide survey.
Now, in the remaining 60 seconds or so that we have left, if we can perhaps conclude with some recommendations or suggestions that might have emanated from your report, what's needed here from global governance when it comes to the rights of Rohingya refugee children and their education?
Well, one call that's also been made by Human Rights Watch is that governments could make their donations conditional on some of the money going to education, because you can't just treat Rohingya like animals in a zoo and just feed them. You have to help them help themselves. Partner with Rohingya leaders, ask them what they need, build trust, support financially. And the international community has been generous, but the money is not going to education. Allow that to happen. And stop with the negative xenophobic discourse. It doesn't help anyone. And there are other ways to keep power if you're in government. You don't need to do it that way. We have other recommendations, specifically, of course, allowing certification, a pathway to higher education. Give them hope. Allow them to have hope. Stop, oppressing an already traumatized community. Rohingya have a lot to offer. They don't want to be a problem. They want to be part of the future.
Let Rohingya Learn, a major report published by Adam Carroll, who is Director of United Nations Programs at Justice for All's Burma Task Force. Adam, thank you for your important time today.
Thanks.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha and Adam. Education is definitely a human right. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Muslim News has covered the Pegasus spyware scandal extensively. In one of our previous in-depth analysis, we discussed how this is being used in India to spy on journalists. An Indian journalist is now with us, joined by Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Let's take a look.
This software will turn your phone, iPhone or Android, against you. It will record you through your own mic, and its camera will be used to record where you're doing. This is only small things. Where you're going, what's your data, all will be available to whoever is spying on you. And there's not much you can do about it. Actually, not much we know about it. The software called Pegasus, it's an Israeli company which produces it in close cooperation with the Israeli government. They give it to other government in the name of fighting crime and terrorism. Haven't we heard about that before? And it's just amazing. About 25 years ago, before 9/11, a friend told me in New York that your phone, in those days, we used to have those bulky phones sitting next in our living room. It could be turned into a listening device. And I thought, guys, somewhat, lost it. Well, he wins, I lose. Now information isn't public. In India, while it is happening in 40 countries, in India, it's making a big news. There is one editorial around the world at this moment, but in India, many media is writing about it. Actually, the Indian Prime Minister Modi is being accused of treason or a spyware scandal, as it is called there, because it is used on opposition leader. But a whole lot of journalists, at least 40 journalists in India, are being spied on through this particular software. And one such journalist is with us from Delhi, Paranjoy Goha Thakurta. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you, Malik Janab. Thank you for asking me to appear on your program.
Well, in Indian media, quite a bit of talking about it, but not as much in America. And the Guardian seems to be the only newspaper so far who has decided to write an editorial on it. And they call it weapon of mass repression. Do you agree with that?
In India, over the last several decades, there have been over a dozen instances of phone tapping. And even chief ministers have had to resign their positions because of these allegations. So phone tapping is not new. In 2009, the corporate lobbyist Neera Radia's phones were tapped, and there was a big hue and cry. So what's new? What is new about the Pegasus spyware is that we've seen journalists, those in the political opposition, social activists, civil servants, and even ministers in the government all being targeted. Secondly, it's it's an issue that doesn't concern India alone. There are 17 media organizations, and that includes the Washington Post and the Guardian and Le Monde. And these phones, there are thousands of these phones on the database, and they are in 45 countries. In India, seems to be one of the areas or one of the areas where there's a large concentration of these phones which were contaminated or infiltrated, but they're there in many, many other countries, including countries in West Asia like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and countries of East Europe as well. So, in my opinion, this is a bigger issue. Yes, opposition leader Rahul Gandhi has accused Prime Minister Narendra Modi of treason. The opposition is predictably up in arms. Rahul Gandhi has a very good reason to be upset because his whole phone, 2 of his political aides, and 5 of his social acquaintances who had nothing to do with politics, their phones were also reportedly compromised. We also find names of business persons, aides to the Dalai Lama, Naga separatists. I mean, it's a long, long list. But in my opinion, this is a matter not just of privacy. Of course, individual privacy has been violated. It's going beyond that. And that is, it is an issue of freedom of expression. If this spyware, which is meant to be used by the military services, the spyware or the software is being misused, you are infringing on the independence and the autonomy of the media, of journalists. Because you are trying to spy on them, and you also in that way not only compromising them, but also their sources, people who would be speaking to them on condition of anonymity. But the problem goes even beyond this, I believe. And that is, it's not just privacy, it's not just freedom of expression. It raises huge question marks on the future of democracy.
And future of freedom, I must also add.
Absolutely. So if there is a private company based in Israel with very close links with the Israeli military and the government, and their software, which costs huge amounts of money, millions of dollars, they say, we don't sell it to anybody other than government bodies, law enforcing agencies, to check crimes, to check serious crimes, to check heinous crimes for national security reasons. If that's what they're claiming, after this software and the spyware has been sold, it clearly seems that they have absolutely no control over how this software is misused to spy on ordinary citizens, to spy on critics of the government. We know that Adnan Khashoggi, the columnist of the Washington Post, who died under mysterious circumstances, was killed actually. His fiancé, his brother, his lawyers were all being tracked. We know about the princess from the Emirates. She was taken from a place not far from the territorial waters of India, outside Goa, and the Indian Navy, the Indian Coast Guard took her back to Dubai. So there are huge ramifications and international ramifications. But we have the French president, we have the Morocco king, and yes, one small point, sir, and you can ask me any number of questions you want. A president is involved, the president of France. So it's all, there are all big names, there are all important personalities whose names have come up in this list, which is a French organization, Forbidden Stories, with Amnesty International. And I think we haven't heard the end of the story.
Paranjoy, one of the things is that in the list of the countries which we know so far, most of those countries are dictatorship, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and UAE or kingdom and things like that. But countries which are democracy, like India, electoral democracy, and which has some sort of check and balances, supposedly according to the constitution, are in the name of fighting crimes and fighting terrorism, are the democratic society losing its core values?
Undoubtedly, absolutely, without any doubt. When authoritarian regimes use this software to suppress dissenting voices, freedom of expression, you are effectively destroying democracy itself. You send a chilling effect to those who express their views and says, unless you kowtow before the rulers of your country, unless you become their blind supporters, watch out. We're not just going to spy on you, we're going to record everything about you. So this is, in my opinion, very, very, very dangerous for the future of democracy. So it's going beyond infringement of individual privacy and freedom of expression, and it strikes at the very heart, the very root of democracy and democratic governance.
How did you come to know personally that you're in the list, or you were expected all the time that government spies all the time and you thought you're being listened to all the time, or was it a surprise for you?
No, it wasn't a surprise for me. It's a long story. I'll give the gist of the story to you. I've written about this in the Free Press Journal that appeared earlier in the day today. My friends in the Intelligence Bureau of the Government of India had told me that they had been told for donkey's years to spy on journalists at random. So, as I mentioned earlier, there have been a dozen cases of political leaders being accused of snooping on their political opponents. There are at least a dozen examples from India alone over the last 4 or 5 decades, including the infamous Neera Radia conversations, the corporate lobbyists who had tapped the phones of political leaders, journalists, and so on and so forth. So I was not surprised. How did I get to know? But I was not surprised, but at the same time, I didn't know how, when, who. And even now I don't. The government of India is in a state of denial. It's neither confirming nor denying that any one of its agencies or departments have actually purchased the spyware, the Pegasus spyware. I, as a citizen of this country, I, as a taxpayer of this country, I think I have every right to demand whether my money is being spent by whom and for what purposes. The government claims it's done nothing illegal, nothing unauthorized. Then who authorized them to tap my phone? I'll tell you what happened. In March, Sandhya Ravishankar, she's a very well-established investigative journalist based in Chennai in southern India. She called me out of the blue and said, I have to meet you. And I was traveling the next day, and she says, I'm flying down from Chennai, which is a 3-hour flight. And he said, you must meet me. I said, the only time I can possibly meet you is early in the morning at 6 a.m. So she came to my doorstep at 6 a.m. I was rubbing the sleep of my eyes and I met her. She told me, your name appears on a list and we believe you are among many journalists whose phones have been compromised and tapped. So I said, now what? He says, can we download all the data on your mobile phone? I had an iPhone and I thought an iPhone was pretty secure, but far from it. It's not secure. I was initially reluctant. I said, why should I share all the numbers I have, all the messages I have, the WhatsApp messages, the photographs, the videos, everything. But I had some faith in Sandhya. And then because she's a very good journalist, she's exposed the working of the sand mining mafia in southern India. Be that as it may, I agreed. Then she put me in touch with this France, this Paris-based organization, Forbidden Stories. And two of their representatives, Phineas Ruckert and another lady, they got back to me and they assured me, don't worry, your data will be safe, will be secure, we won't misuse it. So I kind of implicitly believed them, and I thought I should act in the public interest. Many people didn't agree to what I did. So the data from my mobile phone was downloaded not once, but twice. Once online and once physically. Thereafter, they took a few weeks to do the forensic analysis. They got back to me. And they said, yes, your phone was compromised between the months of March and May 2018. March, April, May 2018. So I asked them, who's done this? He said, we don't know. We don't know which agency has done this. But we know your phone was compromised. It was infiltrated. There were attempts to spy. Then they asked me, what were you doing at that time? What were the stories? What were the articles you were researching? So I mentioned that at that particular point of time, I was researching a book that was published about a year later. It was called The Real Face of Facebook in India. And the book is about how Facebook, how WhatsApp has become a propaganda weapon of the right wing, how it is used to disseminate disinformation and propaganda. I was also working on another article which was published in May of 2018 in a portal called NewsClick, with which I've been associated for more than 3 years now. This was about a person called Dhirubhai Ambani. He's no more with us, he's passed away. He used to be one of India's richest men. And this article tracked how his foreign assets moved from one tax haven to another. And we wrote to his sons, Mr. Mukesh Ambani is the richest man in India, he's the richest man in Asia. So we sent them a questionnaire, we did our due diligence, we got no response. So finally the article was published in May 2018. You can read it. Your readers can go to the website and read it. It's titled, Carving Up a Business Empire Through Tax Havens, the Ambani Way. But I can't put two and two together. It was only on Sunday evening that I realized that it was Pegasus, that my phone had been infiltrated and spied into by this Israeli software, spyware, call it what you like. And it was then that I realized it was not just me, that this was a huge story and with international ramifications, 17 media organizations, 45 countries, thousands of phones, not just journalists, all kinds of people. And we were still, I mean, the story is still unfolding as we talk, Janab.
There is more to this story then.
I wouldn't be surprised if more names come out. We already have quite a few heads of state. I mean, as far as journalists are concerned, a journalist from Mexico, he died. I mean, it's a horrifying story. If you want the details, they're all available in the public domain. Forbidden Stories in Paris, forbiddenstories.org. And of course, the Amnesty International has also put out. In India, the Indian partner is The Wire. So those who are interested in the India part will get it from The Wire. But as I mentioned earlier to you, Washington Post, Le Monde, Guardian, among other publications and websites have been giving this story, I mean, and playing up this story. Even, there are no American names involved. That's interesting. WhatsApp has sued this company, NSO, this Israeli company, which makes Pegasus software, in a court in San Francisco. But there are no American names involved. That could be a reason why, as you mentioned earlier, the American mainstream media hasn't given it the kind of prominence or importance that it has got in other parts of the world.
One of the things I would ask you is that Reporters Without Borders already rank India at her 142nd level when it comes to freedom of press. What impact this story will have on Indian media? I mean, there must be more than 40 journalists who stand for the freedom of press in India. So far, 40 names have come out. Do you think people will be more fearful, or people will react strongly against that?
Absolutely. I hope, Yesterday, I was at the Press Club of India. There was a protest meeting. I was among the people who spoke. A lot of senior journalists spoke. We know that across the world, about 180 journalists, their phones were compromised. In India, there were more than 40 of them, but we don't know all the names because some people chose not to disclose their names. Now the question is, what could happen? You know, the Reporters Sans Frontiers, RSF, they're talking about legal action. Within India, they're talking about legal action. Where will it go from here is not an easy question to answer. Because what has happened is when you target journalists and independent journalists and journalists who are critical of those who are in positions of power and authority, the fact of the matter is a large section of the media in India is completely subservient and supine to Narendra Modi's government and has been that way for the better part of the last 7 years and longer. Now, even that small section of the mainstream media, which is taking a critical look at the government, not asking goody-goody questions to those who are in positions of power and authority, and you know, raising issues that matter, this government has been vindictive towards them. A most recent example is that of the income tax raids on Dainik Bhaskar. Dainik Bhaskar, which is a multi-edition Hindi daily, it is one of the largest, most widely circulated daily newspapers in India and in fact the world. And they've been doing amazing reporting over the last several months about bodies and corpses being flowing down the sacred Ganga river, and they deployed 20 journalists to survey what was happening in 17 districts in the eastern part of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and they've come out with some amazing reports. And the government of Uttar Pradesh has just given these blanket denials without denying the facts. So if you hold truth to power, if you report facts, this government seems to be intolerant and vengeful towards journalists and media organizations and those who are doing their job. After all, Malik Janab, the job of a journalist is not that of an employee of an advertising agency. A journalist is not supposed to be a public relations officer of those who are in power. It's your job to question, ask tough questions to those who are in power. It's your job to hold that mirror to society, to hold accountable those who are in power, hold them accountable for their actions, ask them tough questions. So if journalists and the media are unable to fulfill their professional duties and obligations, what is left of democracy?
Well, Paranjoyji, that's where I want to ask you, what's the future of freedom then?
At the end of the day, we have to protest. We have to stand up for our rights. We should not be cowed down. We have to come together and we have to say that, look, do not intimidate us. Do not use the law enforcing agencies of the government. Do not use them as weapons to target your political opponents. So we have to come together, and it's not just journalists, civil society, political leaders, ordinary individuals, ordinary citizens have to come together, because at the end of the day, it's not just an issue that concerns me or journalists. It's an issue of your privacy, your right to free expression, which is a fundamental right of every citizen of India. It's guaranteed by the Constitution of India. And above all, as we've been saying over and over again, democracy itself.
Thank you so much, Paranjoyji. Truly appreciate you giving your time right from Delhi. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube and Facebook. For more content, please keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.